Joining us now from Oxford, England, to give us some perspective is Professor Ian Goldin. Professor Goldin was the former Vice President of the World Bank. He is currently Oxford University Professor of Globalization and Development and author of the upcoming book, Age of Discovery, Navigating the Risks and Rewards of Our New Renaissance. Professor Goldin, thanks for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be on your show.
Now, you've written that humanity is healthier, wealthier, more integrated, and better educated than ever. So the question is, why are so many people unhappy with the status quo? We see it here in the United States, we see it in the United Kingdom, in Italy, in Greece, in the Philippines. What's the disconnect here?
I think you're absolutely right. Humanity is better off than ever in history. Life expectancies are improved, poverty is being reduced. There's so many good indicators. And as I show in this book, Age of Discovery, which has just come out, it's, I think, because of two things that we're disconnected from. The first is when societies change more rapidly, people get left behind quicker. And so what we're seeing in virtually all countries in the world is rising inequality and lower social cohesion. So people feel that this isn't in everyone's interests and that some are being left behind. And the second reason is that the systemic risks are growing. Unfortunately, when we connect and when wonderful things travel, bad things travel too. And so people feel new vulnerabilities. They feel the threat of climate change. They feel the threat of cyber attacks, of terrorism, of pandemics, of new threats like the extinction of many of the biodiverse species and many, many other threats. And so people feel that change is happening too fast and that they're out of control. And of course, when systems become more and more complex than they are because they're more and more integrated, our leaders lose some control. When they say to you, we will safeguard your future, of course, they can't safeguard the climate, they can't safeguard us from cascading financial crises and many other things. And so this requires us to be more joined up than ever before. So I think people are feeling that the system is changing rapidly, and this creates more uncertainty, more surprise, and people don't like surprises.
Now, according to the World Bank, over 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty since 1990. But the bank also says that the next billion is going to be a lot harder. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. It's been the most extraordinary achievement in the history of humanity, because not only have 1 billion people been lifted out of poverty, but there are 2 billion more people in the planet over this period of time since the 1980s. And of course, a lot of this achievement has to do with what's happened, the most extraordinary progress that's happened in China, but it's in many other places as well. The next billion are more difficult because they're in many of the stubborn places. Partly, they're in places which are, on average, wealthier, but where societies are neglected. Parts of countries like the Amazonia in Brazil, like parts of India, like parts of other countries which are doing on average well, but they're pockets of real desperate poverty. And then, of course, there's the countries that are in conflict, and escaping poverty when you're in conflict is a very, very difficult thing. Or the countries where people are basically trapped in poverty because of the natural resources, increasingly fragile climate, etc., like the Sahel. And what's happened over this period of the last 40 years as well is that border controls on migration have gone up. And so the one paradox as well of globalization in this time is that although we're much more connected as societies, people can flow actually less freely over many borders, and that traps people in poverty. So these are the 3 principal reasons why I think the next billion are going to be so much more difficult.
Right. Now, in your book, you say that there is rising anti-immigrant sentiment in places like Britain, anti-trade agendas here in the United States, and we're also seeing ultranationalism in places like India. What you say is what we need is a fresh frame of reference. Explain that to us. What's needed here?
Yes, and Age of Discovery, the new book I've written with Chris Kutana, argues that we need different perspectives, and it looks back to another period of tumultuous change, which was the Renaissance period in Italy. At that time, there was the most remarkable progress the world had ever known. It took Europe from being one of the most backward places to the advanced place in the world in a 30-year period. So this was extraordinary time, and yet it ended in extremism. It ended in a jihadist Savonarola taking over from the Medicis in Florence. And what we need to understand is if we don't care more about people around us, if we don't care more about those that are being left behind in these processes, if we don't care enough about the sustainability of the globalization process, it can unravel. It It has unraveled in the past. It is not, like gravity, inevitable. So we can try and disentangle ourselves. And that, of course, is what we see in protectionism, in nationalism, and xenophobia. It's very misguided, because all the key challenge that we face in the future will require more, not less, joined-upness if we want to manage these big, big challenges of the future. So I think it's very bad for our economies, it's very bad at the national level, and it makes us more vulnerable to the systemic risks. But I can understand the reaction and why people want to withdraw at these times of increasing challenge.
If we look at the current political environment around the world, nobody predicted the rise of Donald Trump here in the United States, or Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, or indeed Brexit in the United Kingdom, where you are. There's an element of uncertainty around the world. We see that on the part of multinational companies. They're sitting on hoards of cash right now. They won't invest because of this uncertainty. How is that affecting expansion, growth around the world?
Well, I actually did predict both Brexit and the victory of Trump, and I think it was predictable because of this rising tide of anger against what people regard as the authorities, the experts that have got us into this mess, the cascading financial crises and the other challenges. And I think people are revolting against that. I think, as I've said, that it's misguided, that we'll have bigger problems as a result of this, but I can understand it and did predict it. Now, sitting on cash and all of these symptoms which we discuss in Age of Discovery is a reflection of this time of uncertainty. When investors are uncertain, they don't invest in the future. And when governments are paralyzed in gridlock, as they are in North America, in Europe, in Japan, in the advanced economies, then unfortunately they don't want to increase taxes, they don't want to invest in the future, and they certainly don't want to become more joined up with others to manage the great challenges. So this is a paradox which is very dangerous. Interestingly, of course, the major emerging markets, China, India, and many, many others, are not pushing back on globalization. They recognize that globalization has brought them out of poverty, and they recognize that they're going to have to work closer with other countries going forward to manage many of these global threats. So we see this real change in the world from a position in the 1970s and 80s where it was the advanced economies pushing globalization. Now it's them resisting and pushing back on it, and we see the emerging markets pushing for more joined-up activity. Of course, what we mean by globalization needs to be examined, and I feel we need to be much more critical about some aspects of it, but not throw the baby out with the bathwater on it.
What about the United States? You know, as you point out, we see countries like China and India fully embrace globalization, but there appears to be growing protectionist sentiment here in the United States to retreat behind barriers again.
Yes, this is very, very worrying. What we know as economists, and I'm an economist, but what we know from history is when countries retreat, they don't serve their own people. Of course, it's the consumers in the end, and it's particularly the poor consumers who will be paying more for their goods and services. So they will be worse off. And of course, it will mean that the country doesn't embrace the changes which are required to remain competitive in a future economy. We know from future episodes of protectionism, especially when they're associated with strong nationalism, not only in trade, but in other dimensions, and a withdrawal from global coordination, that these are the most dangerous times in history for the world. And we really need to avoid this, not only for the sake of the US and the employment rates. Of course, things are doing actually very well in the US in terms of employment and growth, better than they have for many years, and that could be reversed. But also because the great challenges facing from the US will also come from over its borders. So if it's a question of how to manage global affairs, how to manage climate, how to manage pandemics, how to manage cyber, how to manage terrorism, how to manage antibiotic resistance, how to manage the fisheries, how to manage any of these global activities, the US is going to have to be working more, not less, with others in the future. And as it becomes a smaller part of a rapidly growing global economy, that's inevitable, it's going to have to coordinate more with others. So I think that this withdrawal is dangerous for the US and it's dangerous for the world because the US can play such a positive role and it needs to.
Professor Ian Goldin, thanks for joining us, sir.